Hello, welcome to this week's session of Word Crumbs. We are on the 29th week of Ordinary Time, and today I'd like to invite you to just focus on one of the passages of this week's reflection, and to try to see, especially for those who have followed or have been following the daily readings of the Gospel during this week in the Gospel of Luke, I'd like to just try to give some sense or meaning to the message or the interpretation of these reflections or that are being proposed by the church. So the Gospels that have been presented today, or rather the passages, have been mainly from the chapter number 12 of the Gospel of Luke. Luke chapter 12 from verse 13 onwards. And it launched us into what I would call this theme of growth in true riches. Growth in riches that are real, riches that are heavenly riches, or I would even say lasting riches. So it's beautiful to consider when Jesus invites us to consider the true riches and not the wrong riches or halfway or incomplete riches. He's talking about riches that will last in this life and in the next. He's not just talking about riches for the next life, not the life to come, but riches that we can already experience and live and taste in this life itself. So this week, when the church invites us to contemplate, or has invited us to contemplate the Gospel of Luke chapter 12, it's about, I would say, discovering what are these true, heavenly, and lasting riches. Now, for those who have been following the Gospels, or if you have not, you could still read it in this time. It's not very long. In fact, the church distributes it in a very gradual way. And it's from Luke chapter 12, verse 13 onwards. So you can take up the Bible and also read it at your own time. But I would just like to touch on how the church launched this week these readings from this passage. And it's the passage of the parable of the rich fool. So this parable of the rich fool, if we recall, was when a man decides to accumulate all his stuff and says, wow, I've made it, I've got it great, I've got barns, I've accumulated so much, and I'm going to enjoy for the rest of my life. And Jesus says, you fool, well, God told him, you fool, this very night, your life will be demanded from you by God. And so Jesus finishes with one line there in verse 12 that I'd like to emphasize today. This is what happens to those who are so obsessed with earthly riches that they have forgotten about becoming rich in the sight of God. So this phrase here, becoming rich in the sight of God, is what these readings of this week will help us to understand a bit more. Now, what does it mean to be rich or to become richer in the eyes of God? And somehow, what is the message that Jesus wants to tell us here? And I have a question before that, because this passage addresses the human obsession, whether man or woman, with growth, with accumulation, with having more, even though we already have so much. So there's this obsession that Jesus is trying to address there, the obsession of growth. And my question would be, is this desire for growth, the desire for more, the desire for more plentiful or bountiful life, is that wrong? What is Jesus trying to say here? And I guess the word obsession helps us to understand a little bit more. That it's not wrong to have healthy ambitions, healthy desires to grow more, to improve, to better things around us. But the question is, are we doing it in an obsessive way or in a healthy way? So there is something valid in desiring for more, to grow, the desire for growth. And today I'd like to borrow the words of St. Augustine. Actually, if you're interested and if you read the Office of Readings, it's on this very same day, on the Friday of the 29th week of Ordinary Time, the Church proposes this reading that comes from the words of St. Augustine. And he talks about the desire, and he talks about two key words that I would like to emphasize here, which is instruction and ignorance. And he says all of us live with a certain kind of instructed ignorance. And we need to decide where we want to go, to remain ignorant or to be instructed by divine wisdom. In other words, what St. Augustine is trying to say is desire comes from God. When we desire something, it is God himself who plants it in us. But we can decide whether to allow these desires to be instructed or to be carried by this desire in an ignorant way. And of course, when we live with a desire in an ignorant way, then it can become obsessive or destructive. But when we live with desires being instructed by God's wisdom, by God's word, by our faith, then it can become something productive and even improve the manner of our lives to find these heavenly or lasting riches. So I'll give you an example about this being instructed by riches, in our desires to have more. So just imagine, if you're a person who is obsessed about being rich, and you want to accumulate more and more for yourself. You want assets, you want health, you want life, you want more experiences, all kinds of accumulation. I mean, we don't just accumulate money, we accumulate as well all the different information, ideas, etc. So imagine you're a person who just is obsessed about being rich, and you accumulate more and more, and because you want to secure your life, you want to be secure and to live this life in peace. But then again, when something happens to us, it helps us to realize that wisdom also comes from frustration. What happens to a person who is just obsessed about accumulation in order that they may be instructed or grow and be removed from ignorance is the experience of frustration. So for example, a person who is just focused on accumulating much for himself or herself starts to feel isolated. Loneliness comes in. There's a certain kind of emptiness and feeling like I'm the only one fending for myself, and even fear and insecurity, even though I have so much, as typical. The more we have, the more we need to secure it. And the more we need to find ways to secure what we have, the more we are worried and fearful in our daily lives. But what happens to a person who, for example, experienced that frustration of being alone in richness? Just an example, there's this saying in Chinese that when you share with others, you're actually buying their goodwill for you. In a sense that when we start to share, instead of accumulating for ourselves, but sharing what we have accumulated with others, somehow we are more and more certain that when we are in trouble, the people that we have helped will help us in return. Now, this is a very human way, it doesn't even take the gospel to understand this, but it is a kind of wisdom that if we are generous with people, they will be generous with us in our time of need as well. Maybe not in the level that we would like, or as much as we would like, but in a certain way, they would come to our help. So what is a greater richness there? What is more lasting in our riches? Is it the wealth or the riches that we accumulate for ourselves, or is the wealth of goodwill that we can get in others when we share our material wealth with them? And would that not secure us, give us a more lasting security by being generous with them? This week, Jesus presents us with another part of this Luke chapter 12 to present us with a model that is instructed towards true riches or true richness, and is that of the wise and trustworthy steward. Remember when Peter was saying, "Are you saying this to us for everybody?" And Jesus is somehow like trying to tell him, hey, if you really want to learn how to be instructed in your desires for riches, to find true riches, be like the wise and trustworthy steward who, when the master will place over his household, will give all those in his charge in the proper time, their allowance of food. Now this is Luke chapter 12, verse 42. Luke 12, 42. If you like, it's a beautiful verse just to pray about. And here Jesus speaks about two things: stewardship and wisdom. The idea of stewardship in the sense that whatever riches I receive on this earth is not just for me, but it's meant to be shared to others in the right time, in the right way, meaning we are managers or stewards of what we receive. An ignorant way of desiring growth would be to consider that all this was for me. And that would lead to its own kinds of frustration, as we were sharing a while ago. But the person who is wise as a steward would know that what I receive in this life is meant to be shared. And if we live with that kind of mentality of the gospel, that what I have is meant to be shared, then somehow we live with more peace, because anyway it was not meant to be mine. And if it's with me while I have it, well, that's great. But meanwhile I have it, it's better to start sharing, because the slower I start sharing it, the sooner I'll feel the frustration that it doesn't really give me the joy, the fullness, or the security that riches was meant to give. So that's it about stewardship, that whatever I have and I accumulate and I desire to have is meant to be shared. And I think that is a very healthy balance to live Christian ambitiousness or Christian desire. Accumulating whatever it is, it could be knowledge, it could be virtue. I can accumulate more virtue, I can grow in virtue, I can grow in material wealth even, I can grow in the capacities, the knowledge that I have, and so many other aspects. I can grow, but all this is meant for others. That's the first thing that Jesus teaches us, our stewardship. But second, about wisdom, the wise and trustworthy steward. So not only are we asked to share, but we are asked to grow in wisdom in order to find true riches. And I would like to propose something that for you to reflect about, and it's really this I mentioned a while ago. Wisdom grows with experience of frustration. If we never experience frustration or limit situations in our lives, we will not be challenged to grow in wisdom, to grow in the true sense of life itself. But when we meet frustrations, when we meet limit situations, whether it's in our work environment, we could meet those frustrations, or whether it's in our relationships, we could meet limit situations when we don't know what to do or what to make out of it. When we meet limit situations even in personal health, and it really touches our flesh, it touches our lives and our whole sense of being in this world, that is a time where we can choose to grow in wisdom. Now, growing in wisdom through frustration, of course, takes a lot of humility to accept it, but as well it takes a lot of trust and faith in God in order to seek meaning in the midst of those frustration and limit situations. What is the real riches or the lasting riches or heavenly riches that God wants us to find in those limit situations or frustrations? Wisdom can be said to be teaching knowledge. When we receive wisdom, when we grow in wisdom, we receive something, a kind of treasure that is meant for future generations. Wisdom by itself for our own self is very limited, but when we consider wisdom for the sake of other generations, to teach them really what life is all about, then wisdom becomes more and more valuable for us in this life and in the next life. So today, in this spirit of seeking true riches, lasting riches or heavenly riches, let us ask ourselves, do we have any limit situations or frustrating experiences at this moment, whether it's in our health, whether it's in our work, or whether it's in our relationships? And if we do, and our answer is yes, that I feel a certain limitation or difficulty at this moment, let us ask ourselves and to ask the Lord, what is the wisdom there that I'm meant to learn so that I can transmit to others the real sense and meaning of life? What is the real riches real meaning that I'm meant to learn here? And in this reflection, I leave you with, I don't know whether it's a challenging or comforting word of Jesus in verse 48. He says there, when somebody is entrusted with much, much is expected from that person. When someone is entrusted with much wisdom, much suffering, much frustration, there is much that the Lord is expecting from each one of us. So when we receive limit situations, frustrations in our desire for growth, and it seems to come to us, the answer for this growth comes to us in a very strange way that we can't understand, and maybe opposite to our own concept of what growth is all about. Let us try to interpret this to say, the Lord is entrusting you with much. The Lord wants to entrust with you the wisdom that is meant for many, but that can only be learned by somebody who humbly and trustingly accepts the frustration in order to grow in this lesson of wisdom.